There's something paradoxical about modernity. On the one hand, we've solved a lot of the mechanical challenges of human life. We have antibiotics, we've solved famine, infant mortality rates. But at the same time, the societies that are considered to be the most successful in terms of material affluence, technology, and even the ideas of autonomy and individual freedom are also the societies that suffer the most from mental health crises. They have the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and even suicide. And the problem has been pointed out by social theorists for well over a century now. So, someone like Emil Durkheim wrote about anomie, this phenomenon where this excess of freedom and choice comes with the degradation of the social fabric. The mores, the customs that used to hold and tie people one together end up disintegrating. And what happens is people feel unmoored and uprooted, and it leads them to actually taking their own life. Or Max Weber, who talked about disenchantment, the notion that everything in existence seems to be completely sapped of meaning, significance, value, that we've prioritized bureaucratic rationality and efficiency so much that we've completely lost a sense of orientation in the world. We feel ourselves enclosed in what he describes as this steel hard shell. Everything feels cold to the touch, lifeless. It feels alienating. And more recently, scholars like Jonathan Haidt, who wrote The Anxious Generation, talks about something very similar. What all of them have in common is this idea that part of the crisis that human beings now suffer from is has to do with the loss of religion, the death of God. So Jonathan Haidt is approaching this from a completely secular perspective and talking about how, in his opinion, every human being has this God shaped hole, and you can either fill it with something noble and virtuous, or it becomes filled with garbage. And the philosopher and neuropsychiatrist Ian McGilchrist also comments on this inverse relationship between high individualism and material prosperity and the sense of meaninglessness and alienation. He talks about the crisis of meaning that human beings suffer from in modernity as being a consequence of our neglect of religion or the decline of religion or our privation of religion. We really just kind of shove it into this private aspect of our life, and it has nothing really to say for the more significant or important elements of human existence. And for Ian McGilchrist and Jonathan Haidt, this explains a lot behind the current crisis of meaning, the feeling of alienation, the mental health crisis, the high rates of suicide. But the thing about this is it's not necessarily a modern problem, strictly speaking. I mean, sure, in modernity, this has been intensified to a degree that hasn't been seen before in human history. But because this need for transcendence or to connect to something sacred, what religion really provides is something that is innate to human being. Humans can suffer from this deprivation no matter whether you're living in the modern period or you are living in a different period of human history. And it's important to appreciate this because it doesn't mean that we are necessarily fated towards feeling this sense of alienation, feeling this sense of purposelessness and a lack of meaning. And there's a Muslim scholar who wrote about this issue 1,000 years ago. His name was al-Rāghib al-Isfahani, and he wrote this short book called تفصيل النشأتين وتحصيل السعادتين, which literally translates to the two originations and the two felicities. But it's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm translating it as the art of being human. And what Al-Raghib talks about is the idea that to fulfill our humanity, to realize our true purpose, we need religion. Welcome to the Great Books of Islam, where we're going to be talking about Al-Raghib's book, The Art of Being Human. This is the first in a three-part series. Episode 1, What is a Human Being? little bit of background on the author. Al-Rāghib was born in Isfahan, but he made his career in Baghdad during a time when the city was undergoing this cultural efflorescence. It was a period of intense intellectual and scholarly productivity. People were translating the Greek philosophical texts. They were writing on science, on literature, on language and law, all sorts of things. And Al-Raghib is drawing on this wide and rich scholarly tradition in order to explain, in his view, what is the problem that plagued his society, which in many ways is one that plagues modern societies, and how we can actually realize our true potential as human beings. He's a complicated scholar in that he defies categorization. So some biographers pointed out that Al-Raghib is someone who combines Sharia and Hikmah, or the science of religion and revelation, and philosophical wisdom. And he himself describes his intellectual profile as combining the insights of the Ahl al-Athar, which for him is different from the Ahl al-Hadith in the sense that he utilizes and draws on the prophetic tradition and the reports of the early companions and scholars of the Prophet ﷺ, but he doesn't just take them at face value. He tries to dive into the deeper meaning and understand the significance of their teachings from a historical and philosophical perspective. And then he's also incorporating Sufism, or spiritual praxis and mystical insights, the tradition that basically teaches you how to cultivate a moral and more virtuous self by ridding yourself of vices, clearing yourself of these moral and spiritual toxins in order to open yourself up to certain spiritual disclosures or insights. And he's integrating these different traditions together in a seamless and harmonious synthesis in order to write about the purpose of human existence and how to become a human being. So if you want to summarize Al-Raghib's book in a nutshell, it's that being human isn't a given, it's an achievement. You might have the physical form of a human being. You walk on two legs, you speak, you reason, you're able to use tools, you engage in politics, but you're not a true human being just because you do those things, right? Because you can actually end up just being no better than an animal if your whole life is oriented towards material consumption and these frivolities. So Al-Raghib is trying to remind the reader of, okay, you're a human, you're a special type of creature. How can you live up to your potential as a human being and actually realize your humanity? So that's really the book in a nutshell. And you achieve happiness, Al-Raghib says, by fulfilling and achieving your humanity. So when Al-Raghib was commenting on his society, he said that the human being has become a rare type of creature. It's almost like an extinct animal, almost like a mythical creature, really. He says it's like a phoenix. We have an idea of what a phoenix is, but everywhere we look, we can't seem to find one. And he says the human being has become the same sort of thing. People have become distracted from their purpose, and as a result, their humanity has diminished. And as a result, they're not really human anymore. So humanity for him is really a spectrum. You can be more or less human. And he wrote the book as a practical guide or a philosophical guidebook of sorts for how to fulfill your humanity and become more human. So where does one start? Al-Raghib says that you start by knowing yourself. It's not with religion, strictly speaking, not with God, but you actually have to start by looking inwards. And he draws on this ancient wisdom, which is also reflected in a prophetic tradition, "Man arifa nafsa arifa rabbah." The saying is, if whoever knows himself knows his Lord. And Al-Raghib is making the point that everything begins with self-knowledge. You have to know yourself before you can know anything else at all. This is important in a number of respects. First of all, if you don't know yourself, you can be deluded. You can think that you are someone who is intelligent, capable, successful, whatever it might be, but you don't realize that you are actually sort of not that great of a person, or you are filled with your own vices, whether it's envy or greed or stinginess. And the reason why it's important to overcome these self delusions is because you need to rid yourself of these vices in order to live up to your humanity. Self knowledge is also important to have a deeper understanding of our psychology, because for al-Raghib, it's important to be able to distinguish between feeling and reason. Do you just feel things to be true and beautiful and virtuous, or do you actually know them to be so? For him, there's an objective answer to all of these questions. At the same time, it's important to know the self because you need to be able to have self mastery in order to carry out your function as a human being. If you are going to go out in the world and cultivate the soil in order to grow vegetation, or to herd animals and tame them, or to even raise a family or to establish a household, all of these require certain skills of management and ordering that depend on you having the skill of self mastery to begin with. You need to have a certain discipline over yourself before you can be good at doing anything else that extends beyond the self. And ultimately, the self knowledge is important because it is a prerequisite to knowing God. You need to know your limitations as a human being to understand what is the nature of divinity. How does it transcend our capacities as human beings? And here he quotes the saying from Imam Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet ﷺ, who said, "Reason is for upholding the ordinances of servitude, al-ubudiyya, not for grasping the nature of lordship." So Ali's point is that human reason is limited in what it can know. It can't tell us about God's nature, but it can tell us about our nature, and that's important. In fact, essential if we are to understand what our function and what our purpose is. And at the same time, what this tells us is the type of relationship that we are meant to have with divinity. And in order to understand the human self, Al-Raghib says that we need to understand existence itself. What are the types of things that we encounter in reality and beyond? And existence is made up of different types of entities from an ontological standpoint. What that means is that God created certain things that have an intelligible or spiritual nature. So in Islamic theology, this is like the preserved tablet that records everything in existence and the fate of the cosmos. Also the pen, al-qalam, that was used by God in order to transcribe everything in the preserved tablet, right? These are the higher intelligible entities. And then you have spiritual beings like angels, and you have then physical beings that are the things that we interact with on a day-to-day basis, elements in nature, animals, water, what have you. So Ar-Raghib's point is that human beings are made up of all of these substances combined. And because each one of them has a different nature, human beings have a composite nature that reflects each and every one of these substances. So in order to understand what humanity is, what it's like, in order to understand human nature, you have to understand the ontological nature of these different substances. So consider physical materials, right? We know that human beings are created from earth, from dust. That means that human beings are prone to degeneration or to decomposition, that we have a fragility about us. And then this dust, this earth, heat was applied to it according to the Quran, right? Salsalin kal-fakhar. And what that introduced is this fiery dimension or this fiery nature that we share with the beings that are made of fire, like jinn and devils. So we have this passion or temptation towards power, violence, domination, envy. That's part of human nature. And at the same time, this clay vessel a spirit was breathed into it, according to the Quran. And that's our angelic dimension, our ability to know good and evil, our ability to realize virtue, to understand beauty, to know God. All of these things work together. And Al-Raghib's point is not that we are necessarily predisposed towards evil or predisposed towards good, but that we have these multiple potentialities within us. And it's not that we need to snuff out certain elements of them, but we need to harness them and channel them in the appropriate way if we are to be fully human, because human beings are complicated, complex, and layered in this way. And it's not an accident that God created us with all of these different features and capacities, but they are meant to serve us in a certain way. And the book, Al-Raghib says, is about teaching us how to dispose of these different potentials and capacities and skills. Al-Raghib actually does have a theory of evolution. And it's not like Darwinian evolution in the sense that things happened randomly through natural selection and mutation, but he does say explicitly that elements or minerals evolved into plant life, which evolved into animal life, and then human life, and then humans acquired these other capabilities and characteristics. And Al-Raghib's point is not that this is a sort of accident of creation, but that human beings are the culmination of creation. This is where everything was meant to lead to. We are the telos, the end point, the goal. He says that everything in existence is actually there just for the entire sake of serving humanity, for the existence of the human being. And it's not just there for humans to exist, but also for us to realize our duty as God's vicegerents, as his deputies, his khulafa. So let me read a quote. He says that the purpose of the world and of its being brought into existence, one thing after another, is that the human being should come to be. The aim of the elements is that plants should come from them, from the plants that animals should come, from the animals that human bodies should come, from the human bodies that rational souls, al-arwah al-natiqa, should come, and from the rational souls that the vicegerency of God Most High, Khilafatullah, upon this earth should come, by means of which, through fulfilling its due, one reaches eternal bliss. As God says in the Quran, indeed, I am placing on the earth a vicegerent. Inni ja'ilun fil ardi khalifa. God Most High has made the human being the extract and cream of the world, the one singled out for honor, and he's made what is besides him like a help for him. So this is why everything exists, right? So that human beings can fulfill this function of being God's vicegerents. So what makes human beings special, Al-Raghib says, is not the fact that we're strong or that we have the ability to live for a particularly long time. You know, other animals are more successful in this regard. But instead, it's the fact that humans have this special capacity to be God's vicegerents, that we have been charged with this special task. So based on all of this, Al-Raghib says that we need to think of the human being as a microcosm. Essentially, the human being is like the cosmos, but in miniature. And he has this metaphor. He says, consider the universe as like a book. Well, the human is just an abridgment of that book in the sense that we contain all of the meaning of the universe, but in an abridged form. And the implication, and actually he sort of fleshes this out in greater detail, is that if you want to understand the meaning of what it is to be human, how we condense and abridge this meaning of the universe, well, you can study nature in order to get the fuller analysis or commentary on these various meanings that we carry within us, right? So you can actually study plant life, animal life, whatever it is, the cosmos, in order to understand more about the human self. So he doesn't really see the human being as being separate or distinct from the rest of creation, but rather there is this interconnection that if you want to understand yourself better, you need to understand nature better. And if you want to understand nature better, you also need to understand the human better. So, how does this actually look like in practice? So, I've mentioned a couple of points. You can look at minerals. We're carbon based life forms. We have a tendency to decompose. We are like plant life, right? We can acquire nutrients and grow. We're like animals in the sense that we have a more developed consciousness. We can experience pleasure, pain, desires, attractions. We have certain instincts. We are like devils in the sense that we have certain propensities and inclinations uh, to sometimes do bad things. We can be violent, we can be aggressive, and these aren't necessarily in and of themselves features that we need to neglect or completely stamp out, but we just need to channel them in the appropriate way. So something like aggression needs to be cultivated and shaped in order to develop the virtue of courage, for example. Uh, we are also like angels in the way that we can worship God, we can appreciate virtue, beauty, goodness, and we can come to know God. And here's where Raghib makes a really interesting point, because we are also like the celestial entities that I spoke about just a moment ago, like the preserved tablet, al-Lawh al-Mahfuz. The preserved tablet has within it inscribed all of this knowledge and wisdom. And Al-Raghib says the human being is a tablet in the same way. We have this wisdom and knowledge that is inscribed within us. We're also like the pen, al-qalam, in the sense that the pen transcribed this knowledge and information, and human beings can also speak. Our speech can actually affect and influence reality. So think about what John Austin wrote in his book, How to Do Things with Words, or John Searle wrote about in The Making of the Social World, right? We use language to create and alter our reality. We speak things like money into existence, or we recognize marriages by literally speaking them into existence, and in that way alter the relationship between human beings. And so Ar-Raghib is pointing out to the fact that human speech is not something that should be taken lightly, but actually has this deeper cosmic significance, which is really a remarkable point that Ar-Raghib is saying about language, right? He's saying that it's something significant and tremendous and awesome, the fact that we can speak and alter reality in this way, because what we're actually doing is we are harnessing a cosmic power whenever we speak. The human being, however, while we're made up of all of these different constituent elements, we're not reducible to any of them, right? When you bring all of them together, you get something new entirely. It's like a dish of chicken tikka masala, right? You had onions, garlic, spices, tomatoes, chicken, cream. You add it together and then you get something completely new entirely. And human beings, yes, we're not as delicious as chicken tikka masala, but we're as complex, or maybe a little bit more complex, right? And his point is that we need all of this complexity in order to achieve our function of being God's vicegerents. And what's really fascinating here is the point that he's making is, if you want to be a good deputy of God, well, you need to be able to understand God's creation at a very deep level, right? So part of our job as human beings is to cultivate the earth. We need to establish civilization in a way. We need to grow crops in order to feed ourselves, in order to create this division of labor where some people are sewing clothes, somebody's a blacksmith, somebody provides lumber. All of us then work together in this harmony, but for every individual to do their job well, they need to have a deep understanding of the material that they are working with. If you want to be able to raise animals, Al-Raghib is saying, well, you need to understand animals at a deep level. And you need to understand yourself at a deep level in order to understand animals too. And when you're understanding animals, they're also teaching you something about yourself, about how you are supposed to relate to animals, how you are supposed to relate to nature. And in the relationship that you cultivate with them, you end up transforming the relationship that you have with yourself, the relationship that you have with God, and ultimately realizing and living up to your potential as a human being. And what sets Al-Raghib's theory of human nature apart from any other theory of human nature that I'm familiar with, at least, is that it's not reductive, right? He's not saying that, oh, human beings are prone to violence, or that we are naturally good, or that we like to dominate and control things, or whatever it may be, right? These are the reductive theories of human nature that explain the natural law theories of philosophers like Hobbes and Locke that shaped European philosophy and political theory. But Al-Raghib's theory is completely different, because he's saying that there is no one human nature, that human beings actually contain this multitude, and we contain these manifold potentialities. And this ultimately is going to inform his social theory, his political philosophy, and also his philosophy of religion, as we're going to see. So human life is characterized by this complexity, by us having these multiple layers, but it's also characterized by a drama. And the way that Al-Raghib describes this drama is that each one of these different elements of our nature is pulling us in a different direction. So the animalistic side of us is pulling us downwards. We want to consume, we want to procreate, we want to enjoy pleasures, we're trying to avoid pain. And it's important to have these capacities, but it's also important that they don't become our focus, our obsession, because then they will distract us from our higher potentialities, which is our angelic side, our intellectual side, our spiritual side. At the end of the day, we need to consume, we need to procreate in order to be human beings, but the point is not to do that. That's not our purpose. That is just helping us achieve our purpose of living up to our humanity and cultivating this relationship with God. So, Al-Raghib so far has explained or defined for us what it means to be a human, but he hasn't told us how we can achieve this humanity. And we're going to cover that in the next episode. But just to preview Al-Raghib's argument, it's that religion can't be reduced to, this idea that is meant to be a comfort or just a set of rules. It is those things, but it's also a lot more. Ultimately, for Al-Raghib, religion is about teaching us the art of being human. Religion gives us the capacity to achieve our humanity. So humanity for him is a spectrum. You can be more or less human, and you need religion in order to realize or fulfill the fullest extent of your humanity and your potential. And Al-Raghib is going to show us how living out this purpose is a way for addressing the crisis of meaning that human beings can suffer from. If you feel that there's a sense of alienation or purposelessness, Al-Raghib is saying that, well, it's because you've actually lost touch with the entire purpose for which you exist. And religion is here to remind us of this purpose and help us along the way towards achieving it. By painting this picture of human nature, Al-Raghib has alerted us to the staggering potential of humanity. It's this really vast vision of what human beings are capable of achieving. And the reason we're able to achieve it is because we contain this manifold potentiality, all the way from the capacities of minerals and plant life and animal life, but also it goes all the way up to the cosmic potentialities that describe our capacity for speech, our capacity for beauty, for intelligence. And it's all being distilled, integrated, and synthesized in one particular being, and that is us. We're the only type of thing in existence that combines everything together in this way. And that's because we're the only type of thing in existence that's also been charged with the special task of being God's vicegerents. So in the next episode, we're going to see how Al-Raghib thinks that we can fulfill this potential. And he's going to take us into his theory of society, his social theory, his political theory, his moral psychology, and also his philosophy of religion. If you want to know more about Al-Raghib's philosophy of human nature and what it means to be human, then make sure to subscribe so you can be notified for future episodes. And check out my Substack page, islamicbooks.substack.com, where I have a companion piece that features original translations from Al-Raghib's book so that interested readers can take a deep dive with the primary source material. I'll put a link for that in the description. Thank you for watching.